me, Polly?
I can hear you, but you sound faint. Is that Dan?
Okay, I think I turned on my speakers on the computer.
Yeah, don't do that. David suggested you don't use your speaker computers.
Okay, well, I didn't know how I was able to figure it out, I think, but if it doesn't sound good, I can go back to the telephone.
It sounds too distant.
Yeah, and it echoes. So, not a good idea. Now, just stick to your landline, okay?
Okay, we're recording now, Holly.
Okay, so we're underway. And I want to welcome and greet all of you who've signed on to join this webinar. We're calling it Emerging Approaches to Ministry. At the outset, I must ask you to please mute your microphones, whether you are on your phone or on the computer, to eliminate any noise that will interfere with the presentation.
This is starting.
Thank you for doing that. Please make sure you've muted your microphones. Some of you may be joining us through GoToMeeting and some by phone. We welcome all of you, and we hope that our hour together will be a support to you in your ministry. As always, we ask God's blessing on our time together. This session is a result of quite a bit of reflection and conversation with three ministers who serve on the Ministers Council Ministries Team. They are the Reverend Dr. Randall Harris, who's a pastor of Tabernacle Baptist Church in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. The Reverend Dr. Richard Haley, who's the pastor of the First Calvary Baptist Church in North Andover, Massachusetts. And the Reverend Dan Hopkins, who's pastor of Tell City First Baptist Church in Tell City, Indiana. I am Holly Bean, and I'm the coordinator of the ministries team, and I'm so pleased to introduce these folks to you today and to welcome you to this time. I will be your moderator today. Our session today will cover three topics. First, Randy Harris will share his thoughts on the value of mutual support among clergy. Next, Dick Haley will offer his observations of what some younger clergy are thinking these days. And finally, Dan Hopkins will offer his experience of maximizing your gifts in community. When all three have completed their presentations, we will take time for your questions and comments. For those on the GoToMeeting site, I will attempt to advance the PowerPoint slides that accompany our presenters' words. I appreciate your keeping your microphones muted until it's time to ask questions. For those who are familiar with the chat feature of GoToMeeting, you can certainly type in your questions as we go, but we will defer answering them until the question and answer time at the end. So with that, let's begin. Dr. Harris, please share your thoughts with us.
As we begin our approach to speak about the value of mutual support in ministry, for the group of us that have been in ministry for some time, we can and we should realize that at times in ministry, ministry can be very stressful, causing what we know as burnout. But there's a remedy for all that we do. There's a remedy for all that we put ourselves through, as well as the stuff that is thrust upon us by either organizations or by our own ministry itself. First of all, too many of us are carrying too much on our own shoulders. And unfortunately, when this sort of thing happens, this would be a great time to hand some of the stuff, these responsibilities that we have, on to somebody else. Rather, we ought to delegate some of this to somebody else if we have that resource that is available to us. some time ago, after thinking about the levels of stress in pastoral work, I realized that there was no one in particular that dictated my schedule or the amount of hours I was working. The only person that was doing that was me. My problem was that I was putting in 50 to 60 hours a week working at the church, and I was stressing myself. I was burning myself out and not smart enough to tell myself that it was time to take a much-needed break or even a few days off. It is no wonder that in doing things such as I was doing, that roughly half of seminary grads leave ministry within the first 5 years of their ministry, and nearly 15% of pastors consider resigning from their post. Allow me, if you will, to suggest to you that ministry today, it's no joke. Ministry is more than a social club. It's more than a platform that we just come in and sing a few songs. It's more than just delivering a word, more than doing all of that and then going home. Today, preachers, today, pastors, today, evangelists are so involved in community development, both spiritually as well as naturally, but have concerns about schools, safety, security, prison reform, the spiritual climate in the church, the spiritual climate outside of the church, and the list goes on and on. And it's no wonder a pastor of this nature could and would and does experience difficulties in the community, in the church, as well as in the home. But yet at the same time, every pastor, and I mean every pastor needs to have another pastor to mentor them and just be a friend. And I know some of you might be asking the question, why? Why? Because we need, and we think we are failing. We as people think we are falling down. We think we are personally falling down or in ministry, in our ministries, and we need somebody to lend a listening ear to us without us feeling that we are being judged or that we are being criticized. And unfortunately, we often give ourselves our own report card, and we give ourselves a report card with a failing grade, oftentimes because we view ourselves, and notice I said that oftentimes we view ourselves less than, and I mean really less than. We less than because we think if our projects or our works are not like somebody else's, we thought that they would be what they are, because we're looking and we're also hearing other people and other places. We're seeing how their ministries are going on and how they are actually bubbling or doing what they're doing. And so we look at our own work. We look at our work and sometimes think that our work is not up to par. And so we struggle, and very seldom will you and I admit that we are not really doing so well. Next slide, please. And because of those struggles, some have done themselves harm physically. Some have abused their family members or treated themselves to some type of destructive behaviors. A case in point, a few years ago, one fellow pastor committed suicide because he didn't think he had anybody else to turn to. He didn't think he had anybody else to tell his troubles to. And so, unfortunately, he did his own self in. But we as a pastor, we as ministry leaders, have to know that there are other people out here who will lend an ear to us. There are other persons out here who will take the time to hear what we have to say. There are other people who will openly come to us if we will just give ourselves the time to do what we need to do. So here are some thoughts about our own thing. Who is it that really makes our schedules? We do. We make our own schedules. We realize that nobody else is dictating to us how many hours we have to work. There's nobody else dictating to us when we should or when we shouldn't go home. But the point that we have to figure out for ourselves is when we get to that point where we understand and know of a surety that something is happening within us that we should take a break, we need to do so. One of the greatest things that I have done when I feel like I'm being stressed out is I go bowling. Yeah, I know we might laugh or think that's not a good thing to do, but man, you could take some frustration out on some bowling pins if you just go to the alley and just take some time for yourself. Maybe you need to take some time away from your location and go out and listen to some good music, something that's soothing to many of us. But the whole thing is that we need to get away from the things that are stressing us out. We need to get away from the things that are hampering our own progress. And so in closing, one of the reasons we in the Ministers Council have each other that we can lean on. We have each other that we can depend on. We have each other that when we feel stuff is happening beyond our control, that we can call somebody, that we can reach out to somebody. And so I trust one of us will be available. I trust that one of us will always be by a phone. One of us will be in person. And by all means, if you ever feel this way, as the song says, you can reach out and touch somebody's hand. And if you reach out, I guarantee you somebody will reach back. So God bless you all. And at the conclusion of our session, if you have any questions, I will be available.
Randy, thank you so much for that. And now we'll turn to our next topic, which is going to be led by the Reverend Dr. Richard Haley. So, Dick, you're on.
Thank you. Of course, the overall topic is this emerging trends in ministry, and I want to take a look at what some younger clergy are thinking, and this has been on my mind for quite a few years. I was, for almost 9 years, I was the Dean of Students at Andover Newton Theological School, working with students just entering ministry. And for about 20 years now, I've been working with our region's ordination process and the committee that's responsible for that. And I've watched people as they've started ministry of all ages head into their first pastorates and beyond. And I'm particularly concerned and interested in what some of our younger clergy are facing as they begin ministry. And one of the things that I think is emerging, and by the way, what I'm saying is not based on some sort of scientific study arising out of the social sciences, but it's more on my years of experience working with people heading into ministry. So is that scientifically valid? Probably not, but heck, I think it has something to say. One of the things I see emerging among our younger clergy in particular, and when I talk about younger clergy, I'm thinking of people, say, I might expand that out even 40 years of age and younger, 35 years of age and younger. And one of these emerging things is the struggle, and I'm not even sure it's a struggle anymore, between full-time and bivocational ministry. The concept of bivocational ministry doesn't seem to bother a lot of younger clergy. They seem to view that with some sense of positiveness as an option that is clearly available to them. A couple of people that I've spoken to very recently see themselves mixing academic and pastoral ministry together with a primary focus on pastoral ministry, maybe working part-time in some sort of teaching scenario. There's another woman I spoke with recently who really sees herself working, and I'll use a nice little seminary word or phrase, in situ, when it comes to her ministry of pastoring amongst millennials and Gen Xers where they are. And she would like to do that particularly with the blessings of a church, if that is possible. All of the people that I've been dealing with over the years really have a strong sense of pastoral calling to ministry. When I say pastoral, I mean very strongly relationally oriented. A lot of one-on-one kinds of ideas about what it means to be a pastor. A lot of our younger clergy, at least in my experience, are not all that interested in the administrative side of things. They're very interested in what it means to be among the people that they are ministering with. And they are struggling with a church-based or an alternative kind of scenario, and this goes back to the bivocational sort of thing. A number of people that I've talked with recently who are in that age group of under 35 really see their ministry as being focused on the unchurched, and you don't find a whole lot of them in the church. They really want to target their ministry towards young people and young families in the millennial or Gen Xer age groups, wanting to minister with them where they are at, being present in places like Starbucks or nightclubs or bars and other non-religious settings, and seeing nothing wrong with that. And they would all like to do that, again, with the blessings of a local church, which leads then to the challenges that some of our younger clergy face, and that's in the next slide. All of us entered ministry at some particular time in our life and faced the challenge of change versus tradition. And I think that is especially, well, not unique, but very present with some of the younger clergy today. I've sensed a lot of dissatisfaction with traditional church. One young pastor put it to me recently this way: while I may see, and I'm quoting almost word for word, while I may see the need for the church to do something radically different, local churches seem willing to make only slight adjustments. And I echo that. I think there's some truth to that. I had the experience of knowing a young pastor a few years back whose church abutted a low-income housing project. This was an urban setting. And he got very interested in reaching out to that low-income housing project, and he was kind of an athletic sort of guy, so he would go out and he'd play basketball with the kids in the little basketball court there, and got to know some of their families, and had this idea of starting some sort of summer youth ministry there at the housing project, only to run into resistance at his church. A number of people felt that he was wasting his time, that he should be spending more of his time with the church members. As was communicated to me by another young person recently, the world inside the church speaks a different language than the world outside the church. That is one of the challenges that our young people are facing, that change versus tradition, and I think it's very pronounced today. Another challenge they face is Baptist polity. Almost all the Baptist people that I have spoken with recently express frustration with some aspects of our Baptist tradition. The decentralization and downsizing of regional staff that many regions have gone through leaves particularly younger clergy who don't have a lot of background, not knowing who to go to for resources or for answers. There's a lack of strong association connections these days among a lot of regions. A lot of churches seem to be going it alone, and that bothers some of our younger clergy who feel as if they're just left out there without any backing. And almost all of the young people that I've been dealing with over the years do not have some sort of lifelong American Baptist connection. So they come into our denomination without the connections that maybe many of us had when we came into ministry. They have no past tradition or people upon whom to draw. I was talking with one young man who is pastor of an American Baptist church in our region who doesn't see himself staying with the ABC in the near future, not because he's mad or upset about anything. He just sees that there are more effective opportunities for him to minister in another structured environment. And that concerns me about some of our younger clergy and where they may be going. And in our next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what younger clergy are thinking about in terms of preparation. Almost all of the clergy that I've seen coming through Andover Newton, coming through our denominational ordination process here in Massachusetts, and just whom I've gotten to know over the years, whether they are American Baptist or not, view seminary preparation and education as crucial and formational in who they are. And of course, that's still a challenge today because of the costs associated with seminary education. But I also found that there's very little agreement among young people over which courses or emphases of a particular seminary are the best preparation for pastoral ministry. There was one relatively recent Harvard Divinity School graduate that I spoke with who said that his academic preparation at seminary was somewhat lacking in his in preparing him for pastoral ministry, but then he praised his field placement where he actually got to work in a church and saw that as crucial. Another recent seminary graduate I talked with spoke highly of his CPE, clinical pastoral education experience, and how that was formational for him. And I think this raises a lot of questions for us in American Baptist churches about the rise of lay training programs. Are they any more effective than seminary, or should we really be sticking to the seminary education as foundational for pastoral ministry? And one other thing that I have sensed as an emerging, as I don't even know if it's an emerging trend, but it's just there. So many young pastors have spoken of the lack of meaningful mentoring as they move into ministry. I know that when I entered ministry these many years ago, we had a program here in Massachusetts called the Pastoral Guidance Seminars, which was designed to last for 3 years. It was all voluntary, but we have nothing like that anymore. And I'm pretty sure that many of the regions of our American Baptist churches lack either the funding or the personnel to carry out some kind of meaningful mentoring program. And that goes back to what Randy was talking about in terms of burnout and that sort of thing. The statistic that he cited about young pastors leaving ministry within their first 5 years is one that I've seen in a number of different places. And I think a lot of that can go back to the lack of mentoring that is there. So these are some of the things that are going on as I've experienced in, say, the under 35 crowd as they move into ministry. They're challenges for all of us, and I hope we can keep these in front of us as we continue to work with those who are coming after us. Thank you.
Dick, thank you very much for that wonderful set of reflections. And so now we're going to move to another angle on this, which will be led for us by the Reverend Dan Hopkins, who is pastor in Indiana. So Dan, you're on.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for letting me be a part of this webinar, and I'm looking forward to sharing some things with you and being a part of this conference with these other pastors. As I considered the idea of utilizing our gifts in ministry, one of the things that drew me to this webinar was the truth that for the 29 years that I have been in Christian ministry, more than half of those, I have been in bivocational ministry. And you heard Richard mention that a little bit. I want to share a few statistics. According to Lifeway Resources, more and more folks are shifting to bivocational ministry in the pastorate. More than 75% of Baptist churches are less than 100 people, which means that most pastors can't do it just on one income. They need other ways to support their family. In the Nazarene church community, 40% of their pastors are bivocational. For me, I spent much of my ministry years also working in full-time Christian radio or serving as a counselor or supervisor at a children's home in Louisville. I also have spent the last 23 years serving as a high school tennis coach in Indiana and Kentucky. So early on, I had to figure out how to find that delicate balance between all of these commitments and expectations. And I will tell you, sometimes that's still a work in progress. But that being the case, as we consider the idea of maximizing our gifts in ministry, there are three prevailing thoughts that I would like to share today. The first is we need to know our gifts. And not only to know your gifts, but to utilize your gifts and maximize the opportunities you have to put those gifts to use in generating income and balance in your personal life. There are lots of gift tests out there, lots of ways of knowing what your gifts are. We make the assumption that people in ministry have done that and know that, but that may not be the case. In the case of the Apostle Paul and Jesus, they both tested high in the gift of craftsmanship. For the Apostle Paul, we find in Acts 18, he was in Corinth and met up with Aquila, who served as a tent maker. And it says in verse 3 that because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. Some scholars consider what Paul did leather working. So he, during the week, did his tent work, leather work, and then on the weekends spoke in the synagogues. Now, the truth is, back in ancient Judaism, it was improper for rabbis to receive money for their teaching. That may be why the Apostle Paul at times struggled with being supported, and why in the book of Philippians 4, he was so blessed by that church that supported him and believed in him. How much of all that went into play is unclear. But the truth is that it was hard for him to create income simply by speaking. And he was willing to do manual labor, and so he put his gifting into use and supported his ministry in practical ways. For Jesus, we know that he came from a long line of carpenters in his family, probably. His dad, Joseph, was a carpenter. But clearly he had that gifting as well. When he returned to Nazareth, his hometown, and the people recognized him, in Mark 6:3, their comment was, "Is this not the carpenter?" Not just the carpenter's son, but they identified him as a carpenter. So clearly their reference to him was one working in this area of tradesmanship to be able to generate income before he went into full-time ministry. So think about ways, consider ways that you can know and then utilize your gifts to not only find balance, but to perhaps generate outside income in the life of your family. Think about and think beyond traditional ministry tasks. Think outside the box and how you can possibly utilize your gifts in different ways. The second point that I would like to share is something that I heard Rick Warren say a while back, and this is what he said. He said, "Don't just pastor your church, pastor your community." And that resonated with me as I considered many ways that we can, beyond our regular and normal circles of influence, be able to be effective in reaching our community and beyond with the gospel, and how that might be a blessing not just to their life but ours. Think about ways beyond your normal circle of influence in your community that you might be a blessing to others. There's lots of secular and Christian organizations that are around you that might be opportunities to serve. One of the pastors in my region literally serves on his town's Chamber of Commerce. And what an awesome influence he can be in his community. At the high school, which is close to our church, I'm actively involved. In fact, I'm sort of responsible for the Fellowship of Christian Athletes chapter here at Tell City, and it gives me opportunity to speak into the lives of of a number of kids from various backgrounds and denominations to be able to speak into their lives in ways that are encouraging. One of the things I believe in strongly is something called servant evangelism, which is the idea of showing God's love in practical ways. And I had this idea that if our church could be a blessing and utilize the gifts that we have and talents that we have in our community, that we'd have this great day of service. Now, one of the things that we do in our community is have a really strong pastors group, and so I brought it to them, and they bought in and decided to take some ownership of it as well. And we're about to, in a couple months, have our second annual Great Day of Service, in which we are looking for practical ways and other ways to bless other people and show them God's love in practical ways. One of the things that our pastors group does is rotate articles in the local newspaper. So several times a year I have the opportunity to speak words of truth, not just to my church, but to the community at large. And really it's a lot of fun. The third thing that, as we turn the page, the third thing to consider in regards to maximizing your gifts in ministry is something that I call embracing the power of diversion. Finding diversions in your life for the sake of your health and ministry. Recently, my wife and I were watching a movie called The Intern. And it has Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway in it, and it's really a good movie. I recommend it. And Anne Hathaway owns this fashion business, and she's just on task all day long, scattered and worn out. Robert De Niro's this intern sitting at his desk at the end of the day, fiddling, trying to figure out Facebook. And after this long day of work and feeling totally exhausted, he asked for her help with trying to get on Facebook, and she says to him, "That's great. I need a diversion." And the truth is that we all need diversions sometimes in our life to be able to remove us from serious and intense tasks that ministry can often define. The definition of diversion is an activity that diverts the mind from tedious or serious concerns, a recreation, or a pastime. For some, it can be travel, going to places that you've never seen before in our United States and beyond. For some, they enjoy working in their gardens and dealing with plants and vegetables and that sort of thing. For some, they have a real passion for cars and autos and fixing cars. And I've got a guy in my church that loves to bring his old auto to the car shows. For some, it may be sports and finding diversion there. For Randy, it's bowling. For me, it's tennis. And so we identify that bowling pin or that tennis ball as that person in our church that just hasn't yet learned how to be a blessing to our lives. Or maybe that situation going on in the life of our church that has yet to be able to be resolved. We talked about some burnout factors, and I want to go back to that for a few moments because I think it's relevant here. According to PastorBurnout.com, 90% of pastors work at least 50 hours a week. In other words, most pastors work too much, and they aren't able to find that healthy balance in their lives. 60% of pastors have either 1 or 2 vacation weeks a year. That's all their church has allowed them. That's not enough. The last church I worked at provided 4 weeks of vacation a year. The church I'm at now was going to offer 2, but I negotiated to 3. And they'll usually do that if you consider these things during your interviews. Another fact is that 40% of pastors and 40% of their spouses suffer from frantic schedules and unrealized expectations. They thought that this was actually going to be fun. They thought the ministry was going to be a blast. I'd get paid for serving God. Really? Until they settle into the minutia of trying to please others. Listen, the best way for you to be an unhappy camper is trying to please others. And so these unfulfilled and unrealized expectations come into play, and they aren't able to find ways to find balance in their life and create healthy diversions. Chuck Swindoll once put it like this: beware the barrenness of a busy life. One of the things for me that's a diversion is, for a number of years now, from time to time I'll do flea markets, and I'll go on eBay and I'll sell collectibles and toys and comics and that sort of thing. And not only is it great diversion, but it does, again, help create income to be a blessing beyond the work structure. So considering all of these things and embracing the power of diversion, if we move to the next slide, for the sake of your health and ministry, so important that you intentionally, it's not going to happen by accident. It's not going to happen just suddenly you find yourself just with nothing to do. You have to intentionally disengage from a single focus on ministry. And maybe you need people in your life to help you with accountability there. You need to seek balance through variety and find different ways to enjoy life beyond ministry. You need to exercise. Fact, 57% of pastors do not have a routine exercise plan. And as you know, exercise is a great way to relieve stress. Lastly, and most importantly, I think, try to have fun. Listen, if you're not having fun, pretty good chance your partner in marriage isn't having fun, and your family isn't having fun, and probably your church isn't having fun, because it filters down. And listen, being miserable is not the best way to witness, but more importantly than that, it's not what God intended for your life. Nehemiah tells us that the joy of the Lord is our strength. So it's so important to find freedom from the task of ministry and be able to refresh yourself and put a smile back on your face. So, considering all these things, how can I have more fun? Doing what I love, fulfilling my calling to ministry, building the church, and being a blessing to my family. Now, it may be challenging to find that balance, but it is so worth it to try. Thank you very much.
Dan, thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, Randy and Dick and Dan. Now we're going to attempt a question and answer period here. And this will challenge my technological skills, but I invite you to offer a question. And in order to do that, you will have to unmute your microphone and let us know that you want to ask a question. While you're thinking of that, I did receive a question through the chat from Alan Seelig, and his question is, and this I would suggest Randy and Dick and Dan, you could begin to address, how can we address the disconnect between the younger pastors who are oriented towards unbelievers and the churches they serve who may be oriented toward maintenance of the current membership?
This is Dick Haley. Let me throw out two observations about that question. A number of years ago, one of my students from Andover Newton, someone who we would call a younger clergy, worked at setting up some sort of a support group of younger clergy via Facebook and those sorts of things. And I would encourage younger clergy to do that sort of thing, to get together with each other for mutual support around those issues. And I think the other thing that is very, very important that we here in Massachusetts, and I suspect our denomination as a whole, is lacking on, and that is that sense of meaningful mentoring. You know, we lack the power of the bishop to force younger clergy to do certain things. We lack the organizational power to put into place something that is almost mandatory. There are sometimes I wish we could do that sort of thing and make mentoring and support groups and all that sort of thing mandatory, but we can't. But there may be some ways that we can really strongly encourage it.
Ministers Council is all about providing support to one another, I think. The thing that I would echo with that is that even pastors need pastors.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
you need to find someone in your life that can speak into your life, whether it be another pastor in town or someone who can just affirm and encourage you. But also, there are lots of other pastors who are in churches across the country that you can find sermons via the web. And I listen to several of them. I try to every week and gain perspective and ideas and that sort of thing that give me insight that maybe I haven't considered, or different ways of doing things I hadn't really thought about before. So this idea of mentoring and having a pastor to speak into your life is really important, and to find connections with those around you. Pray for someone in your community who might be able to be a support to you, a prayer partner, someone who can support and encourage you in ways that are blessing.
Hi, this is Randy.
Yeah.
One of the things that, listening to the question, is that there are times when we as pastors need to find some common ground with those who are not engaged in our churches, who are not coming to our churches, and then sometimes we have to think outside of the four walls of the church. As we go out into the community, we find things that, healthy things that younger people can be involved in that would bring them into the church. But these are groups of people who will probably never set foot inside of the church unless we go out to meet them where they are, and just share with them sometimes that we have too many high standards when it comes to the church, or we have too many high standards when it comes to what an inside of a church should look like to those who are on the outside. And then a lot of young people in our areas will say, well, what can the church do for me? What can the church offer me? And these are the things that we as pastors and preachers and evangelists need to have ideas as to how we can engage with them, and also how we can relate with them and hopefully bring them in. But sometimes we have to meet them where they are. Sometimes we have to meet them on their levels as well, but not in a sinful way. I'm talking about in a healthy way to bring them into our churches.
And I think another way to encourage the younger clergy who have this heart for the unchurched is to do some, at the regional level, some radical thinking alongside churches that may be fading out of existence. I know we did that with one particular congregation here in Massachusetts, and basically used a building that a church wound up having to sort of give up or go out of business, or whatever the right wording is. And we did a whole new church start there, and it's attracting a whole different crowd of people than the old church used to attract. The old church is gone, but there's something new emerging, and there's been a lot of support from our region, not a lot of monetary support, but at least a prayerful and administrative support to help that church get going.
You know, when I went into ministry, one of the things that I was confident of, that I could just make everybody happy. I mean, I could just figure out how to keep everybody just be a happy camper. The reality is that is not going to happen. And there's some people that don't want to be happy, and you can't make them happy. And so you've got to find that balance between serving and being responsible to those in your church family and beyond. And yet still finding that balance and not being caught up into that trap of just being a people pleaser, because all that's going to leave you is frustrated.
Dan and Dick and Randy, we have a couple more questions coming up that I'm seeing on the chat here. One of them is from, I think it's Dondria Walker. And Dondria, if you have unmuted your mic, you're free to ask your question.
Okay, I guess from a transitional standpoint, I don't think seminaries can necessarily prepare students coming out of seminary like myself just to understand the body of politics that already exists prior to you getting there. And I think, I don't know, it's through denomination or through seminary that they can offer classes to prepare seminarians coming out of school to let them know that you won't be the pastor initially starting out. And it'll take some time before people will embrace you as the pastor, as well as learning that the whole new different dynamics that the Bible or just the theology that we sometimes ascribe to is not what the church that you're going to will actually lift up, if that makes sense.
I agree.
Well, may I also add a comment there? One of the things that I learned in the 45 years that I've been ministering, a lot of that as pastor, then sometimes as an associate, was the fact and is the fact that many of us, I'm going to use this expression, that we have to learn how to ride in a second chariot. We have to learn how to allow ourselves to grow into a ministry while the pastor is still the pastor. There have been cases where, and please don't take this the wrong way, there have been cases where you may minister better than the pastor, but because he or she is the pastor, we have to respect that position until God places us in a position where we become where they are. And so it's a learning process, and learning processes like these are not always easy, but the patience that you have to develop in learning to be a good assistant, a good follower, a good leader will propel you into that next step or next phase in your life by learning how to be right there with that pastor.
And I think we all want to support the idea of seminary training for those called to ministry. It seems like in our culture more than ever before, they are looking for the fact that you've earned your keep, that you have a degree that proves that you're not just out there on your own, but that you've gone through the training and equipping necessary to do this. But there are lots of ways to get that done. So don't get discouraged, but look for ways to better educate yourself. We know that our calling is not from the seminary. That doesn't validate who we are. But in the eyes of the world, those are things that are still valid.
Okay.
In terms of seminary education.
Do you have a comment? Yeah, sorry.
Central Baptist Seminary out in Kansas has kind of rethought how to go about doing seminary education, and the President, Molly Marshall, just had an interview article in the Christian Century about some of the changes that they've had to make over the years, and it's worth taking a look at that particular model for those of us who still consider seminary education to be very valid and necessary.
Yeah, good point. We have a question about something that was said in the presentations from Corey Field. Would you like to ask your question, Corey? And I'd encourage anyone who has spoken to mute their microphone again, if you don't mind, to help the sound. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Corey.
Hey, so it wasn't really a question, which is why I just typed it in the chat, but I think I heard someone say that young clergy, may not like traditional church. I think there's an important distinction to be made that Diana Butler Bass has talked about, because the young ABC clergy that I know, myself included, actually highly value tradition. What we find oppressive is convention, and I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, this is Dick, and I made that comment, but I think I said that what they find is frustrating, and I affirm exactly what you said. I think the frustration that younger clergy and those of us who are aged clergy have with tradition is precisely what you identify as convention, and I would just affirm what you said. That's kind of the distinction I was trying to make.
So how can you embrace those things creatively?
Yeah, my son is in that millennial Gen Xer age range and goes to a large church in Washington, D.C., enjoys it very much, and it's very targeted towards the younger generation, the under 30 crowd. And while he and his wife enjoy going there, they don't see that as the place that they will be for the long haul because they value some sense of tradition as well.
Okay. Can I move on to the next questioner, or does someone else have something to add to this? Okay. We had a comment from Sarah Fogg, who is part of the Chaplains and Pastoral Counselors chapter of the Ministers Council. Sarah, would you like to say a word about what you're thinking about and ask people for responses?
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We have been talking about in our executive committee finding ways that we can both be more visible to our pastor clergy and make contributions. And we have wondered if making ourselves available, finding a structure or way to do that, to local pastors who might like to have ordained clergy like ourselves available as resources to them on emotional or spiritual questions with which they are wrestling, but which they may not be ready to bring up to their executive ministers, but would like someone outside their specific circle, American Baptist and ordained, to talk things over with and receive support and additional ideas. And we're wondering how that would be received by local pastors. Would that be something they're interested in or not so much?
Anybody want to respond to that? Go ahead.
That's a toughie.
Can you say more, Randy?
Actually, it's the engagement is of such that all of us have to, we just have to make the approach as to how we present our thoughts to those in the leadership positions, and then to see how they're going to be responding to what our suggestions are. So we know we sometimes we don't know what other people are thinking until we engage them into our conversations, or that we ask them to feel the feel of what we're talking about, and just to see what happens from what we present to them.
I guess my question is, what do you want to see accomplished in these discussions?
Well, I think it was the first speaker, Randall Harris, who was talking about local clergy often feeling isolated. He gave the extreme example of someone eventually committing suicide, who were unaware of resources available to them. We chaplains and pastoral counselors are still pretty invisible to other clergy, even in our regional areas. All of you have been presenting your comments referring to local pastors, evangelists, and so forth, not mentioning the other ordained clergy in the American Baptist circles. So it's not surprising that local clergy do not know of us, even though they may have taken a CPE unit. For example, chaplains, board-certified chaplains in American Baptist have taken 4, are usually engaged in positions of responsibilities in hospitals, prison ministry, and the like, who have experience that may be of value if it were only known. And so we're wondering if we should continue to think about developing outreach in these ways to our clergy in parish, congregational life.
I think the more that you can think ecumenically, the more that you can think beyond, as I mentioned earlier, your primary source of influence, I think the more you're going to find support and more you're going to be able to be a blessing and receive a blessing. So I absolutely concur with that about creative ways to look into ministry opportunities in your community that may not necessarily be quote-unquote Baptist per se, but definitely things that God can use. So I highly encourage those kinds of efforts and to think creatively in ways to do that.
I'd like to call everybody's attention too, if you are on the GoToMeeting site, to look at the comments. Diana Thompson has entered one asking Sarah if she's speaking about acting as spiritual directors or if she's asking about something else, and Alan's comment as well about some of the advantages of Sarah's idea. Diana, would you like to make a comment, or do you want to just simply leave your question as it is?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I know in many traditions, and I was just at a conference last week where we as pastors were encouraged to find a spiritual director if we didn't have one. And I was just wondering if that was the type of thing that Sarah was talking about, or if she was talking more of a counselor for if you have a specific issue that you're struggling with, or just asking her to flesh out, I guess, a little bit about exactly what she was talking about.
Yes, thank you for that question. We are primarily of two groups in our subchapter of the Ministers Council: pastoral counselors who would be available for I would think more one-on-one counseling issues that arise in all of our lives, where we'd like to have a trusted, ordained and trained colleague available to us, but not be sure where to find one. So that would be one. Chaplains who are engaged in, who are engaged in very ecumenical ministry, usually ministering to people in hospitals and prisons and corporations who are not of their specific faith group, have usually developed resources that they use on a daily basis that might be useful in the local parish, local congregation, to pastors who are wondering about how to reach out to a specific group. That might be just one example of yet another resource within the American Baptist tradition. These chaplains and pastoral counselors, all of us are ordained American Baptist clergy, and so we share the understanding of our faith tradition, and yet are dealing with, generally our audiences and work is among those who are not in our own tradition. So we have these resources that might be useful to local American Baptist clergy.
Thank you, Sarah. That's very helpful. There's some comments coming up in the chat I would draw your attention to as well. And Deborah Jackson has weighed in here on networks of spiritual directors. And typically, I understand spiritual directors, many of them anyway, do not charge for what they offer. This is a whole concern that I think would warrant its own webinar at some point. Maybe we should think about it. But I thank you for your questions. We're coming up to 3 o'clock, and we want to keep faith with your time. So let me ask if anyone else has a question for our wonderful panel of speakers, or for anyone else before we close out this session. Okay. And therefore, in closing, I really want to thank our presenters who've worked hard on thinking through these topics and working up the reflections they wanted to share with you. I'd also like to thank David Cushman from Valley Forge in the Computer Center, who has helped us make all the technology work. Without that, we would be nowhere. So thank you very much, David. And as always, we are indebted to the gracious and hardworking staff of the Ministers Council, Ms. Joyce Moon, who is our executive assistant, and our executive director, Dr. Deborah Jackson, who has been on the call with us all of this time. So thank you both very much for all you've done for this, and I want to thank all of you for calling in today. We have been recording this call, and we can make it available to others and to you. I just have to find out how, so I will do that, and we'll find a way